This is a history of nitromethane. Not the history of nitromethane, a history of nitromethane. I say that because it's a story that could be told any number of 100 ways, from the raw perspective of science, the stuff's incredibly numerous triumphs in industry, its use in the space program, agriculture, medicine, and of course auto racing. I'm going to tell this story in a couple of parts, and this is the first. It will take us from the 1800s, when nitromethane was first made, to the year of 1960, when it was making headlines for all kinds of reasons, both good and bad. By the nature of my own interests and the approach of this channel, the video will be heavily concentrated on the use of nitromethane as a racing fuel in the automotive world. That'll be kind of the common thread that's used to tie a lot of this history together. Now, that being said, to truly know what nitromethane is, you have to understand the fact that this stuff is kind of a wonder liquid that has uses in many fields, applications in so many places, and a history that ranges from wondrous to downright terrifying. We all know a little something about nitro. We know that it's powered race cars to speeds and performances beyond anything any other fuel and reciprocating engines has ever done. We know that it can turn those engines into scrap metal with incredible violence. And finally, we know that it is expensive as all get out, and it's not getting any cheaper. Lastly, like many of the videos I make, I plan on setting the record straight on some of the largest misnomers about nitromethane, and there are plenty. Old wives' tales that have been passed down through the generations and accepted as fact, spread like the gospel, and contain not one grain of truth. So before we get this show on the road, a final word. My goal is to blend enough history with enough chemistry, with enough business and industrial information, with a huge dose of race car and engine stuff, that you truly see how nitromethane, boom sauce, joy juice, fuel pop, whatever else you want to call it, rose from a chemistry lab experiment into one of the most important chemical aspects of the modern world and the single greatest racing fuel ever introduced to internal combustion engines. Along the way, there will be big names, big discoveries, happy accidents, a pair of industrial explosions among the largest industrial incidents the country's ever seen, and curious minds that help to make engines live on liquid dynamite. Now that you know all that, it's time to get started. Nitromethane was first made in a laboratory by a German chemist named Hermann Kolbe in 1872. Yes, I said 1872. Kolbe is considered one of the greatest organic chemists of all time, and his work literally set the course for the modern world of organic chemistry as we know it. Now, as it turns out, there was another brilliant German organic chemist who was working his way to the same discovery, but by a different method. That guy's name was Victor Meyer. Now, these two guys were not considered scientific enemies, competitors, or rivals, but Kolbe was apparently the kind of guy who took frequently to attacking younger scientists in their field of ideas, especially if they were on the same path. Now, he did this in scientific journals, not necessarily in front of their face, but it's very interesting that both of these guys created nitromethane, and they did it in two different ways. Hermann Kolbe's method used highly poisonous chloroacetic acid, which reacted with sodium nitrate in a solution, which made sodium nitroacetate. Now, that solution then gave off its carbon dioxide, and once it did that, we were left with nitromethane. And with it comes the famous chemical formula CH3NO2. Carbon, 3 hydrogen, nitrogen, and 2 oxygen. The carbon atom is important because it forms a bond with the 3 hydrogen atoms. Now, that same carbon atom also bonds to a nitrogen atom, which is part of the nitro group. And the nitro group consists of that nitrogen atom bonded to 2 oxygen atoms. So to clear up a first point, anything that starts with nitro in the name is telling you that it has a nitrogen atom bonded with 2 oxygen atoms in its chemical structure. Now, as you'll find out shortly, not all nitros are created equal, and there are a ton of them. Now, nitromethane has a flash point, which means the lowest temperature its vapor can ignite at, of 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius, a boiling point of 214.2 degrees Fahrenheit, 101.2 degrees Celsius, and an auto-ignition temperature of 784 degrees Fahrenheit, or 418 degrees Celsius. Now, Kolbe wasn't seeking to create this stuff with any clear motive. It was purely kind of an exploration and experiment in his lab. Now, the second guy I mentioned, Victor Meyer, who was kind of figuratively across the road in Germany, had created nitromethane at the same time as Kolbe had, but used a different method, a completely different method. Meyer's approach was so unique and groundbreaking, they actually named the chemical reaction to create the stuff after him. Yes, the Victor Meyer reaction was the product of reacting methyl iodide with silver nitrate. This reaction also produced nitromethane. The downside of both Kolbe and Meyer's methods were that they really weren't scalable to make large volumes of the stuff, and they were very expensive to kind of produce, especially Meyer's that needed silver involved in the process. Kolbe's was effective, but it just couldn't be scaled because of the need for lots of chloroacetic acid, which was incredibly poisonous, and it was even hard to get in the 1800s, probably even harder to get your hands on right now. But it's kind of interesting that both of these high-level chemists were working on this one thing. Now remember, 1872 is about 5 years after Alfred Nobel, a Swedish chemist, had received a patent for dynamite, which harnessed the explosive power of nitroglycerin. Now, there's no record of either of these two men, our German friends here, talking about making explosives at the time, but history tends to reveal itself as time marches on. Interestingly, Kolbe moved on to other subjects and topics in his research, so he leaves our story pretty quick, but Victor Meyer hangs around. A neat side note is that Meyer, as a younger man, was a student and basically disciple of none other than Robert Bunsen. Yes, the burner guy who you probably messed around with his invention in high school. As well known as he was in science circles, it would be 1895 when the world, specifically the United States, really learned who Victor Meyer was and what he was doing. As it turns out, he was perfecting nitromethane into what was then the most powerful explosive the world had ever seen. In newspapers the world over, and for the better part of a year, a single story hailing a miracle new explosive was run ad nauseum from Australia to Montana and all other points east and west hailing this new miracle explosive. It credited Meyer and talked of its strength. So why did this come out in 1895 and not sooner? After all, these guys have been on this program since the 1870s. Now, the pragmatist in me thinks that Meyer had reached a point that many scientists do. Perhaps he needed to sell this creation to someone to continue funding his research. Perhaps he was looking for a large industrial company to take interest and hire him while paying for the rights to use his creation in the process. Maybe the only real sensible option to me is that this guy was simply trying to find someone to give him some dough to keep doing what he was doing. In 1897, the troubled Meyer, long a man tortured with emotional and mental issues, took his own life. This ended a brilliant career and in so many ways closed the curtain on nitromethane. For all intents and purposes, this unique organic compound was headed for oblivion like Roman concrete, Damascus steel, and Greek fire. And it did.
Hey everybody, it's Brian Loans. I'd like to thank Hungry Minds for sponsoring today's video. Obviously, if you watch this channel, you know that I'm kind of a bookworm. In fact, I love books. They're my favorite thing in the world, and getting my hands on a good book is pure magic. Today, I'm going to share some of that magic with you in the form of this, the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization by Hungry Minds. This is a book that is built for curious people, for intellectual people, and for those that can appreciate quality. 400 plus pages, very heavy paper, beautiful cover, beautiful construction, and inside, this book is filled with some of the most interesting information, absolutely wonderful illustrations, and storytelling to beat the band. This really is great. If you're a person who is a curious mind yourself, get a copy for yourself. If you have friends, if you have family that you know would love a book like this, get it for them too. We're talking about a book that spans through art, that spans through industry, that spans through kitchen appliances, aviation, tools, mechanics, you name it. The things that built and moved the world then, the things that build and move the world ahead today. They're all in here. The book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization by Hungry Minds. You can go to the link below, use code BrianLoans10 to get your discount today. And I promise you, as a guy who knows books, both good and bad, and who reads constantly, voraciously, and incessantly, this is one you need on your shelf. If you got that friend, if you got that family member, or if you got that mind that would appreciate this particular piece, make sure you get it. Hit the link below, code BrianLoans10, save money today, get the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization. More than 3 or 4 dozen experts were involved in putting this entire thing together. The art's incredible, it's unique, and you need it. That's it. Now back to the show.
Outside of its use as a chemical in laboratory studies, nitromethane was effectively vanished from about the time of Meyer's death until the middle 1930s. Hard to produce, having seemingly few practical uses, it was something used in explorations and experiments but didn't seem to have any future beyond that. Thankfully, a professor and scientist at Purdue University, a man named Henry Bone Haas, had a very different view of the situation. By 1932, he was running the entire chemistry department at Purdue, and through some experiments in the early 30s, he thought there was a way that nitromethane could be made in mass volume for exponentially less money than it was being made for at the time for laboratory use. In 1935, he and his fellow researchers made their breakthrough. They discovered a process of mass-producing nitromethane from natural gas. Now, this vapor phase nitration process is the same process that is still used to make this stuff today, and it's what brought nitromethane from an interesting laboratory chemical to one of the most versatile and widely used organic chemical compounds ever devised by man. In the most basic, not a chemist terms, what Haas and his team figured out was that they could combine nitric acid with propane at a temperature range of 662 through 842 degrees Fahrenheit, or 350 to 450 degrees Celsius, cool the mixture, condense it, and they had nitromethane. Manipulating their process and formula could deliver them different nitros like nitroethane, nitropropane, and any other number of variants. The first and most basic result, though, was nitromethane. Dr. Haas played his hand conservatively, perfecting as best they could the production process at Purdue and doing incredible research into potential end uses for this new high-volume liquid they were trying to make. When he stood in front of the annual symposium of the American Chemical Society in Richmond, Virginia, in December of 1937, he let it rip. Haas described how the process not only opened up nitromethane for large-scale industrial production, but also how the price went from $10 per pound to under 25 cents per pound to make. He explained that there were 350 billion cubic feet of natural gas being wasted in the oil fields of America alone every year, and that gas could be used in the process of creating nitroparaffins. He described the fact that nitromethane was stable, could be used as an industrial solvent, could help the power output of diesel fuels. With the combo of some formaldehyde, nitromethane became high explosive, and with the addition of fatty acids, it could be used in the manufacturing of plastics, home products, soaps, and yes, it could be an effective additive for shaving cream. All that was fine and dandy, but the true ace up the sleeve of nitromethane to this very day was and is agriculture. Yep, more nitromethane gets shot into the ground every year than used for any other purpose, and in fact, used for most other purposes combined. But how? Believe it or not, that started in 1848. A Scotsman named John Stenhouse created a laboratory chemical compound using puric acid and sodium hyperchlorite. He created this concoction for the same exploratory reasons guys like Colby and Meyer came up with nitromethane. The name he came up with was chloropicrin. There was no known use at the time, but the stuff was interesting, which drove many chemists to study it and try to derive possible end uses. In 1908, it was patented as an insecticide, and in World War I, it was used extensively on the battlefields by Germans as a tear gas, and by the end of the war, both sides were using it. Now, the gas wasn't designed to kill anybody, but it irritated eyes, the respiratory tract, and could induce vomiting if you got stuck in a thick enough cloud of it. The Geneva Convention of 1925 parked it as a weapon of war, and nations had huge stockpiles of the stuff were now trying to find other ways to use it. Since it was already deemed an insecticide and definitely did not agree with humans, what else could chloropicrin be used for? By 1920, it was being studied as a way to battle insects, fungi, and other soil issues on farms, and by the early 30s, it was in reasonably widespread use. A groundbreaking study in 1932 monitoring its effects in Hawaii on the pineapple crop seemed to prove its efficacy. Like everything else, the nation's growing need to produce and feed an exploding population was stressing farms and even farm suppliers to their breaking point. Enter nitromethane and Dr. H.B. Haas of Purdue. By 1938, they had developed a method of chlorinating nitromethane to create chloropicrin in a far more efficient, volume-friendly, cheap manner. It was a process first patented in more rudimentary form in 1934. Somewhere around the 1940 time frame, all chloropicrin was being synthesized from nitromethane. To this day, chloropicrin is used in the millions of pounds, gallons across the country, and it's a virtual guarantee that you've eaten food that nitromethane was integral to help grow. Many will contend that it's only used in the production of strawberries, but that really isn't the case. It's actively used in many different crops, especially like tubers, like potatoes. Okay, all this is putting you to sleep, I understand, but what about the cars? How did it get in to the cars? Well, it got into the cars by way of Italian rockets, for starters. Gaetano Arturo Crocco was kind of the Robert Goddard of Italy. He was a pioneering rocket scientist that built the first liquid propellant rocket in Italy in 1929. He was the head of the aeronautics school at the University of Rome and was able to get the Italian general staff of the military to fund a lot of experimental work. As it just so happened, a lot of that work was being done by a guy named Luigi Crocco, who happened to be GA's son. Now, both men were brilliant and as motivated as all the other engineers studying this stuff across the world. They had their own ideas. And it was in the 1932 time frame that Luigi convinced his father and the Italian military to fund some studies to explore the concept that he had been thinking about for years in his head. And that idea was to study the concept of monopropellant fuels in rockets. Now, a monopropellant, simply put, is a fuel that will burn in the absence of oxygen. Typically, they're pretty nasty things, and Luigi came out of the box hot. This guy was actually working with nitroglycerin mixed with 30% methyl alcohol, and incredibly, he lived through that period of his life. He did have some near misses, and certainly wrecked a whole bunch of stuff along the way, but he didn't kill himself with nitroglycerin, methyl alcohol, and rockets, a combination that has the stability of a 40-foot-tall Jenga tower. Now, interestingly, he next turned his attention to nitromethane. In 1933, he started to mess with this stuff and concentrated all of his energies on it as a potential rocket fuel. It had far better handling characteristics than all the other wacko stuff he had used, meaning it was kind of shelf-stable, and it was actually outperforming them as well. This nitromethane stuff as a liquid rocket fuel seemed like a miracle in the early 30s. Now, as the rocket funding ran out from the government, he did convince officials to allow him to work with nitromethane as a fuel in piston engines. Crocco designed an engine to power torpedoes, and it was summarily rejected by the Whitehead Torpedo Factory, which cited its complexity and issues against the proven method of using compressed air, which is how they were currently fueling their torpedo engines under the water. Now, undaunted, Luigi continued with a, quote, stratospheric engine he was designing. This was to be a piston engine that could operate without the presence of oxygen at very high altitudes, and it was to be fueled by nitromethane. The Air Ministry actually funded the construction of a single-cylinder test engine to prove the concept, and this little engine would actually become a historic first in the history of nitromethane. The engine worked like a diesel. Nitromethane was injected via a diesel pump at high pressure into the lingering hot gases of the previous combustion cycle. Incredibly, it worked. And it also did something else. Exploded. To quote Luigi, quote, the lack of positive lubrication in the diesel pump and the high temperature spots on the piston when, after some minutes of operation, the lubricating film was removed, which caused the explosion in which the testing apparatus was damaged, and both Dr. Corelli and I were injured. As a consequence, the work on the nitromethane engine was suspended in 1935, end quote. Yes, an Italian rocket engineer was the first man to kill a piston engine, albeit a one-cylinder piston engine, with nitromethane in 1935. No kidding. Okay, the cars, right? The cars. I told you we'd need to get to the origins of stuff to really make all this make sense, and we've done that. So now we're off to the cars, and we're going to start this part of the story by blowing up the primary myth of nitromethane's automotive life, and we're going to blow it up into small pieces. The first use of nitromethane in piston racing engines was with the German Grand Prix teams of the 1930s. False, false, false. You've heard it. You've read it. You've likely spouted it off as fact, and I say that because I have too. It's everywhere. The Mercedes and Auto Union teams used nitromethane in the 1930s to dominate Grand Prix racing. But they really didn't, and it's just pure ignorance that has perpetrated this whole thing. Well, from you, from me, and the guys that have written stories about it for years. The most important thing to remember is what I said near the top of this video, which is all nitros are not created equal. Remember, just because something says nitro only means it has a nitro group attached to it. It's really the second part of it that's the important part in the name of anything. So nitromethane is not the same as what we're about to talk about. The confusion about what powered the German race cars in the 1930s shouldn't have been confusion at all, but it was just kind of a misunderstanding that's been perpetrated and repeated ad nauseum through the years. So to start with, after World War II, the British government actually completed a full-blown inquiry of the 1934 through 1939 German Grand Prix racing cars. Commissioned by the British Intelligence Objective Subcommittee, it's an incredible thing to behold. The cars were studied with the same fervor that enemy warplanes were studied with. Every nut, bolt, inch, and yes, liquid were analyzed. Facts were garnered from the former team engineers, former guys who wrenched and designed on the cars, and these reports were among the most detailed intelligence reports that the British government had in their archives after the war. Many years later, somebody found this very detailed study and actually bound it all together. It's a book called Quicksilver. If you love the history of Grand Prix and Formula One racing, you need to buy this book. It is not cheap, but it is incredible. And this is what it looks like. And it's also where we see the fuel that was used in the Mercedes and Auto Union race cars. Royal Dutch Shell prepared and maintained the fuel for Mercedes-Benz and the Auto Union. The blend, which is reported to have been the same and never varied between the two cars, was 86% methanol, 8.8% acetone, 4.4% nitrobenzol, and 0.8% sulfuric ether. And again, this was identical for both cars. But it says nitro, so what's the problem? Nitrobenzol and nitromethane are not even close to the same thing. But again, it's easy to see how this myth was perpetuated, especially if the guys who first started slinging it were in the mindset that nitro is nitro. Just isn't the case. There are all manners of nitro, from nitropropane, as I've said, to nitroethane, to nitrobenzol. We can kind of think of them all as members of the same extended family, but like humans, all of them are different. In this case, nitrobenzol does not have near the power or the punch to bring to the party that nitromethane does. And even at 4%, it would have some measurable power gain, not like today's top fuel cars or anything, but it would certainly give it a little kick if it was nitromethane. The nitrobenzol was, well, more of a stabilizing factor in the fuel. So if nitro didn't make its evolutionary leap to cars through the pre-war German Grand Prix domination, how did it? It certainly took a little more time than anyone would have thought because the world went to war. During World War II, nitromethane didn't really have much of a role. It was mostly experimented with as a potential rocket fuel, but one guy did do some engine work with it. A German scientist named Dr. Otto Lutz did a lot of research into methods of enhancing the performance of German airplane engines at high altitudes. Now, by the time the war tide was turning against Germany, the resources available to design, build, and fully refine whole new aviation power plants just wasn't in the cards for the Germans. They had to make the stuff that they were already using better, even when that stuff itself was declining in quality. Lutz did tests with engines running nitromethane, nitric acid, nitrous oxide, and more. Ultimately, nitric acid and nitromethane were ruled out of usage because they were corrosive to the valves in German aircraft engines. As high-quality metals like nickel and others became more and more impossible for them to get, the metallurgy of parts in their engines suffered, and stuff like this was a result. Lutz published his work, recommended the nitrous oxide be used as the additional oxygen carrier for these engines, and the German airplanes got it in the form of a now widely known GM1 system. It was a stopgap and akin to putting a Band-Aid on a cannon wound. On the Allied side, nitromethane was experimented with as an explosive, and several variants were used for just that. There were two-part mixable versions, a sensitized version that could be set off with a blasting cap, and other science experiments into the art of, well, blowing stuff up. Now, that's not to say that the stuff was abandoned. In fact, it was used in higher quantities than ever in industrial applications, and as we've talked about previously, as a solvent, a base for other chemical-related products, and of course in the agricultural realm. Nitro may not have helped to power the war to a win, but it did a whole lot on the home front, and the nation's appetite for it was climbing, and fast. As the Allies came home, they brought stuff with them. Trinkets, war prizes, German scientists, rocket technology, hydrazine, and every scientific file they could get their hands on. Wait, did I say hydrazine? I did, and we'll be getting into that as well. By 1945, nitromethane was back on the pages of newspapers and in the pages of industrial and scientific journals as a wonder liquid. And then in April of 1946, a landmark moment in the history of nitromethane occurred. Nitromethane in its raw form was released for civilian use. The reasons for this were manifold. For starters, it was safe to handle, and it is pretty safe stuff to handle. Methods of production had been achieved that made it cheap, and more than 2,000 uses for the product had been identified. And there was post-war manufacturing infrastructure in the form of idled nitric acid plants that could start making nitromethane pretty quickly. This 1946 announcement is what paved the way for nitromethane to find its way into cars by way of model planes and model tether cars. Like so many things hobby-related, model airplanes and even tether cars were a big and booming business after World War II. They had been before the war, but it was even larger now. There were a slew of different companies producing engines for the cars and model planes, and as there are in all of these scenes, there were some big players. Firstly, the Dueling brothers. They manufactured engines used by many enthusiasts. Then there was Ben Sherrishaw, a model engine plane manufacturer, and his buddy Ed Chamberlain, and finally a man named Ray Arden. Now these names will make up the most important part of the story about how nitromethane ended up in cars. As it would turn out, the Duelings, Ed Chamberlain and Ben Sherrishaw had all stumbled upon the same idea at the same time: nitromethane. In truth, Ben Sherrishaw and Ed Chamberlain beat everybody to the punch. These guys had come across, by means I wish I knew how, what was likely the Otto Lutz study from the war on using oxygen carriers or oxygen-rich fuels to enhance horsepower. Now this would have been in 1946 or early 1947. The two of them created a fuel which they were selling under the brand name of liquid dynamite. As this was happening, Ray Arden was in the final phases of perfecting the glow plug ignition for model engines. This was a change that would render spark plugs all but obsolete in the modeling world. The glow plug would eliminate weight and complexity, removing batteries and wiring. It would also work wonderfully with this new fuel. So Ray Arden did the sensible thing. He paid the guys for the formula, and in early 1948 launched the Arden Formula B fuel. It was 37.5% nitromethane, 37.5% methanol, and 25% castor oil. As this was happening, the Duelings were making their own blends of fuel and running their own tests on the famed line of engines that they built. They had a Los Angeles supplier for the straight nitro, and they would blend their own mixture in-house. Through my research, it doesn't appear as though the Duelings were selling this stuff commercially, but likely blending it for their customers in a small batch-style basis. Interestingly, they were about to be both impressed and perhaps a little embarrassed. Why? The Arden fuel was just that good. They tested one of their famed Dueling 61 engines on the little dyno they had made to run their stuff. On methanol, the engine made 1.5 horsepower at 15,600 RPM. With the Arden Formula B, it made 1.98 horsepower at 17,000 RPM. This represented a 32% increase in power output, and the increased revs were an indication of a stronger engine. The nitro revolution was on, and it was starting small, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. After their success with the Arden fuel, the Duelings were in the market, as were many, many other companies, to try and quench the thirst of a growing population of modelers who had gone nitro crazy. The performance of their airplanes and model cars were off the charts, and it was only a matter of time before the leap to the big cars was made. Sherrishaw and Chamberlain, thank you, but we're moving on from you guys. But we're not moving far, literally and figuratively. To this point, I have taken for granted mostly the fact that you understand why nitromethane is a great fuel for internal combustion engines. Let's take a quick, and I mean really quick, peek into why this stuff really wakes up a piston engine. For starters, it carries its own oxygen, so it truly is like a liquid supercharger. Secondly, it has a very long and slow-burning quality to it so it exerts its combustion pressure onto the piston for a longer period of time, pushing it in much stronger fashion on the power stroke. And lastly, because of the oxygen content in the fuel, it can be burned in extraordinary volumes that would flood out engines with other types of fuels. The amount of energy in a gallon of gasoline is actually more than in a gallon of nitromethane, but you can burn so much more nitro by volume, you can make exponentially more power than you can with gasoline, which if you attempt to use in the volumes of nitro would either flood the engine or hydraulic it. Nitromethane, though, didn't arrive without risk. Missing the tune-up with the lean nitro mixture will burn up your engine. Suffering an ignition timing issue can often cause the engines to blow up, and failing to ignite those high volumes of fuel can cause the engine to hydraulic or effectively destroy itself by trying to compress a liquid fuel in a cylinder, which causes connecting rods to break or crankshafts to be blown through the bottom of a block. It is just not great. Nitro is the ultimate risk-reward proposition, though, with internal combustion engines. Now that you know that, we can move on with the story. Vic Edelbrock was a man on the rise in the late 1940s. His Edelbrock Equipment Company was innovating new parts, making new hot rodders, and competing in the exploding scene of midget racing around Los Angeles. His equipment was everywhere. His mind was racing with new ideas, and his engine dyno was never empty long enough to cool off. Always looking for an edge, he typically did it with some new design or out-of-the-box thought. This time, though, a miracle came to him. Ed Haddad was a man who Vic Edelbrock knew very well. He was a prominent figure in midget racing, a great racer, a good friend, but he was also the competition. Interestingly, one fateful day in late 1948 or early 1949, though, he was a savior. Haddad walked into the shop with 1 gallon of nitromethane that he had gotten from the Dueling brothers. He couldn't get rid of it fast enough. He was going to try some of this stuff in his car, but people had spooked him into believing that even the container itself could explode at any second, unprovoked. Perhaps knowing a little better, Edelbrock took the jug, and when the coast was clear, he dumped some of it into a flathead engine on the dyno. The result, with very little work, was shocking. A radical jump in horsepower. Whether it was the first test or the first few days in, Vic Edelbrock, Bobby Meeks, Don Towell, and Fran Hernandez finally got a stiff enough percentage of fuel into their engine that something weird happened. The engine had produced so much heat in the combustion chamber that the spark plugs had effectively become glow plugs like the little dueling engines used, and it wouldn't shut off. Remember, we've talked about the auto ignition point of nitromethane, and they had found it. The only way to stop the engine at this point was to stuff towels into the carburetors to get it to quit. And despite the fact that they melted parts and pistons, they knew they were on the right path, but they also had an issue. They were kind of like out of fuel. The good news was that with a 20% load, they had made 40% more power on their test engine than it had ever made before. I mentioned we weren't going far with this story, and that's because the Dueling Brothers shop was a quick trip from Edelbrock, so over he went, asked where they were getting their stuff and how he could get more than a gallon pail of it at a time, and the Dueling boys hooked him up with their distributor, and Vic Edelbrock bought 100 gallons of nitromethane from that distributor. By the time he had burned through that 100 gallons, he knew more about running nitro in a V8 than anybody on the planet, and that's where we blow up the second myth in the history of nitromethane. The commonly stated fact that is actually myth is that the first use of nitro in a race car was in Edelbrock's V8 60-powered midget in 1950 with Roger Ward driving. It wasn't. The first use of nitro in a race car would actually and amazingly happen at a drag race, one that is seen among the most important singular events in the sport's history, and it happened in 1949 on the property of what was then known as the Santa Barbara Municipal Airport in Goleta, California. The former Marine base had ample roads and secluded areas to test a hot rod on, and the local kids knew that. One enterprising guy in particular, Bob Jonick, an accomplished lakes racer, a gas station owner, and hot rodder extraordinaire, knew about this place, and he was one of the guys that began taking his car out there in the 1947 timeframe by his own words. Then in 1948, he was inspired to create the Santa Barbara Acceleration Association and approached the airport management about running organized drag races on the property. The airport manager agreed, contingent on the group getting insurance, and they did through Lloyd's of London. Now, this was for sure the first policy ever to insure a drag racing event in the world, and it cost them the princely sum of $50 a year. This was a humble operation with no real prize money and no media hype, but it was a safe place for hot rodders to go hammer down for a quarter mile at a time. No cops, no tickets, just fun. Little did they know they were setting the stage for an entire sport to grow from. They also didn't know that a single day in 1949 would change the course of drag racing history at their little spot. The date that saw the Little Goleta Street Race drag strip go from a small, forgettable gathering of local hot rodders to the location of the first and then biggest match race in the nascent sport of drag racing history was April 10th of 1949. Tom Cobbs was an area racer who always had nice, fast stuff. Cobbs was moneyed, but he wasn't some sort of a poser. He wrenched on his own cars, built his own cars, and they were fast, both on the lakes and on the street. Just like today, guys with fast cars often have hangers-on who like to brag about their friends' stuff and run their mouths. According to Bobby Meeks, the trusted right-hand man of Vic Edelbrock back then, some of Tom Cobb's guys, without him around, had the wherewithal to show up at the Edelbrock shop and claim that Cobbs could blow Fran Hernandez Roadster into the weeds and really show those guys who was boss. Vic Edelbrock had heard enough. He knew that his new Nitro program was coming along, and having all the dyno experience that he did have, he likely knew about what kind of power Cobb's blown combination could make. Now, these guys got in touch with Bob Jonick, who readily agreed to host the match between the two high-profile cars in Goleta. The guys swapped engines in Hernandez's coupe, taking the street engine out and replacing it with their nitro-proven shop dyno mule, and then they hooked the car to Edelbrock's shop truck and headed to the spot on that fateful Sunday morning. Don Towell was appointed the driver, and according to Bobby Meeks' account of the event, the plan was one run and done. If they beat Cobbs, Towell was to drive the car directly back to the truck, hook it up, and they'd leave. No one knew their nitromethane secret, so the quicker they could win and leave, the better. And win they did. There were no timers, no clocks of any kind, just a dip before a bridge near the end of the track to indicate which car had hit first, and their Hernandez Roadster with Towell driving barely got to that dip before Cobbs. It was tight. The boys loaded up and went home as planned, despite the fact that everybody wanted to see them run again. Not only had Edelbrock and the guys proven their point about being fast, not only had they given the guys at the starting line some weird exhaust fumes to choke on, but they had also just become the first people ever to run a car in a race on nitromethane. And as these things go, it wasn't long before the tinkering with nitromethane spread like wildfire. In fact, when nitromethane's biggest triumph to date was due to happen in August of 1950, the stuff was already flowing freely through the veins of hot rods like Dick Kraft's Bug and others at places like Santa Ana, California at the drag races, which happened well before August of that year. Motorcycles, cars, you name it, even boats were messing with this stuff. Most people were running 10 to 12%, some people 15 to 20%, and the real ragged edge guys were pressing their luck with a 25% load. It was all trial and error on the drag strip. As one guy would blow up and push the limits, the engine was examined and studied, and changes were made to larger carburetor jets, changes in the timing curve, compression ratio, and more to take better advantage of the fuel. It needs to be noted that when we talk about these guys, especially of this time, this was methanol with nitromethane added to it. Now, it should be clarified that the percentage of load was simply a nitro percentage by volume in the tank. For instance, a 10-gallon tank with 5 gallons of methanol and 5 gallons of nitro would be a 50% load. The one thing that drag racers knew was that more equaled more. More fuel load, more fuel volume to the engine, more power, and more risk. The good news for them was that junkyards were full of millions of old flathead V8s, and they were practically giving them away, so blowing one up on a Sunday really didn't hurt you that bad because by the next Sunday you could have a fresh engine in the car. As the hot rodders of 1950 were making their own moves and doing it without much attention, Vic Edelbrock was once again about to show the racing world what nitromethane was all about. Midget racing in Southern California in the late 1940s and early 50s was a massive spectator sport. Thousands showed up to tracks almost every night of the week somewhere to watch the little cars with brave drivers do battle on bull rings. The action was dominated by the Offenhauser 4-cylinder midget engine, and you can learn more about those engines in my video about the history of the Offenhauser on this channel. And yes, some guys are running Fords and other combinations, but the Offies were everywhere, and seemingly better in every way until 1950. Vic Edelbrock had two midgets, one had an Offie, and one had a Ford V860 in it. The engine was a good testbed for speed equipment and trying his own ideas. Roger Ward drove it. Yes, that same future Indy 500 winner drove this car. Now, with their nitro testing in 1949 at the drag strip and all the dyno hours they had at the shop, Vic and the boys decided to unleash the fuel for the 1950 midget racing season. Hiding their secret at the drags was kind of easy. The car was only running for a minute before it was gone. At the midget races, someone was going to pick up on the scent of nitromethane being burned, so how could they mask it? Now, if you've gotten this far, I'm sure you've read the reports of Edelbrock somehow making the exhaust smell like citrus, and most people say like orange peels. After a lot of research, I figured out how he did it. He had to have added a substance called D-limonene to the fuel. Now, D-limonene is a solvent like turpentine that is extracted from the skins of citrus fruits, which could be lemons, oranges, etc., and can be burned easily. This stuff is still made and sold today. You can find it easily. In the early 1950s, the Jet Propulsion Lab actually tested D-limonene as a potential rocket fuel, and the reports were that when they burned it, the entire place smelled like citrus. Now, there's simply no other thing that he could have used to flavor the fuel like this that would have also been flammable, would have mixed with the nitromethane, and also emitted that smell. So D-limonene is the answer to the question about how he made the fuel smell like citrus. Now, that answers that. Their success in 1950 was immediate and immediately in the newspaper. In April of 1950, Ward won at San Bernardino in what was described as a, quote, stunning upset. He was just getting started. A month later, he beat all the Offenhausers at Culver City in what was described as, quote, somewhat of an upset. Why? Well, in the span of 8 weeks, running multiple nights, the V8s had only won twice, and both times it was Ward. This, though, was kid stuff. Gilmore Stadium was the true epicenter of midget racing, and this was the only place that had really put it on the map nationally. It was the crucible that turned it into a national craze. And in 1950, it was celebrating its 13th birthday with a special race on August 10th of that year. Now, it wasn't the first time that Ward had run there in 1950. In fact, he had won plenty of heat races at the place that season, but he had never won a feature. With more aggression in his style, and likely more nitro in the tank, Roger Ward and Vic Edelbrock attacked. Ward worked his way through the heat races and started the main, and in front of a sold-out crowd on the outside of the front row, he ran hard. Alan Heath was his main competition that night, and he was running an Offenhauser-powered midget. On the 16th lap, Heath's Offie-powered car sputtered and dropped out of the race. Ward ran off and hid from the rest of the field, and the win was the first time a Ford V8 had ever won a feature at Gilmore Stadium in 13 years. Newspaper reporting of the event was awesome, talking about the turmoil Ward had caused, the craziness in the stands, and how the victory was such a shocking turn of events. The 7,000 fans packed in like sardines got to witness an amazing moment and certainly the most public triumph of a nitromethane-powered car ever. For a week, the newspapers continued to report on the victory. It undoubtedly helped to elevate Ward's status and place him on the path to superstardom, which he'd achieved by the end of the decade. And for good measure, the drag racers were blasting the nitro horn strongly as well. Poor Tom Cobbs couldn't catch a break. His blown hot rod once again went down to a nitro-swilling job, this time Dick Kraft's Bug, at the end of August 1950. Fun stuff, right? The early 50s would be both a honeymoon period for nitromethane and one where it started to receive the label as the boogeyman of racing. Before we dive into that, let's lock one thing down immediately. This stuff wasn't, nor has it ever been, cheap. The price of blended nitromethane model airplane fuel was about $1.20 a quart in 1949, and if we take 4 quarts to a gallon and use an inflation calculator, that's more than $50 a gallon. In the 1950s, hot rodders and racers in the early 50s, when they were buying the straight stuff, were paying $3 per gallon, which is about $36 today. Of course, they were burning smaller quantities, but nitromethane has always been expensive as a race fuel, mostly because it's the most niche usage of the stuff in the world, both then and now. 1952 would bring nitro its first real brush with mainstream racing fame, and it came from a place that would struggle with its existence for the next 2 decades, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Whispers of some cars tipping the can came in 1951, but in 1952 they weren't whispering, nor were they attempting to hide it. Nitromethane was legal, so if you needed more power to qualify, why not add some to the tank? The motor was largely go or blow at this point, but desperate times call for desperate measures. The stories about nitro in 1952 were pretty tame, but this was the beginning. Meanwhile, our old friend Dr. Haas from Purdue was named the president of the Sugar Research Foundation, and he continued to innovate in different fields, a truly inquisitive and exploratory chemist. Nitromethane in the hot rodding world was no big thing anymore. From the drag strips to the Bonneville salt flats, it was here, it was being used, and it was fully ingrained as part of the culture. At the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, though, things were getting interesting. The racing world's first, and certainly not last, ban on nitromethane had been proposed. A group of car owners tried to have nitro banned for the 1953 Indy 500. They went on a scare campaign talking about the dangers of the stuff. It really isn't that dangerous if it's handled right. The government restrictions on it, there weren't any, and how someone was going to, quote, get hurt, which is comical coming from a group that sent multiple people to the hospitals and graves at this race every single year in the 50s. Unlike the 1952 situation, this one actually got traction in the news. Multiple papers were on it, even places like Popular Mechanics. Former Indy 500 heroes like Tommy Milton spoke out against it, and in order to ban the fuel, every owner at the race had to agree to ban it. Guess how that went? The nitro flowed like wine. The coverage of the race was dominated by talk of fuel, and if it should be banned for 1954. If it was even helping people go faster, and on and on. It was the value of nitro, and it was a hype machine. Now this hype machine got even more intense after the race. Bill Vukovich won the 1953 Indianapolis 500, which was the hottest on record at 91 degrees. Driver Carl Scarborough died of a heart attack, likely brought on by heat exhaustion after the race, and 6 other drivers went to the hospital. The culprit wasn't blamed on the heat. In the public, the culprit was said to be that the nitro fumes were choking these guys out. And in the closing stanzas of the coverage from that year's race, it was pretty well mentioned that nitro would be banned for the following year's 500. Meanwhile, the fuel's popularity and usage was spreading internationally. Sterling Moss was driving a Formula 2 Cooper Alta fuel-injected machine on a load of nitromethane. Yes, that's Sterling Moss. The car was producing stunning speeds, if not lacking in reliability, but Sir Sterling Moss was on nitro. Royal Dutch Shell went into the production of nitromethane in Europe, and they were making it in limited quantities during the 53-54 timeframe. The price? 12 British pounds per gallon in 1953. Yowza. Away from the racetrack, 1954 was a big year for nitromethane. The nation's sole producer of the stuff, the Chemical Solvents Corporation, announced that it would be building the world's largest and first truly bulk production plant for the stuff, which will be located in Sterlington, Louisiana. And they were spending millions of dollars on the plant, hiring hundreds of people and preparing to make nitro and some other nitro paraffins in a volume the world had never seen. As they were doing that, the Indy 500 came along with its typical yearly nitro freakout, threatened ban, failed proposal, and business as usual, just faster and faster each year. But the biggest thing to happen to nitromethane in 1954 didn't involve the Indy 500 or even drag racing. The scientists finally showed up. E.S. Starkman, an associate professor of engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, did a study entitled Nitromethane as a Piston Engine Fuel. It's a great read. He prepared his results in a report to the Society of Automotive Engineers and delivered those results to the SAE National Fuels and Lubricants meeting in Tulsa that year, which created major news. And that major news was carried by hundreds of newspapers around the country for months, and in some cases nearly a year after the fact. So why did Starkman do this? He was actually intrigued with all the race car and model car guys using this stuff and wanted to see if the results that they got from trial and error were actually working, or if this was just some sort of a placebo that was getting too much credit. In his study, which can be read today, he discovered that on a single-cylinder test rig, he could run 20% nitromethane before the engine started experiencing detonation. Was it really the poor man's supercharger? Oh yes. Yes, it was. Starkman, even on his test rig, saw a 13% power increase with 20% nitro, and the hot rodders were likely laughing at him. Why? E.S. Starkman missed the tune-up. If Starkman had continued to get more aggressive with the timing curve, work on fuel volume and compression changes, he could have made way more power on 20% nitro. But what E.S. Starkman proved was that if nitromethane is introduced into an engine with methanol as the base fuel, 20% was the limit you could run without making wholesale changes to the tune-up, the fuel system, and other elements to take full advantage of it. He did show the fact that fuel consumption over gasoline skyrocketed, combustion chamber pressure spiked, and things definitely got more spicy in the engine, but a line from the report clearly laid out the fact that he was an engineer and not a hot rodder. Quote, "Any attempt to burn nitromethane fuel in undiluted form in a reciprocating engine can only lead to disaster." End quote. His conclusions, again, were accurate for what he was doing, but in essence, Starkman wasn't even coming close to scratching the surface as to what he could have achieved in power output from these tests. Still, the report's a fun read, and his conclusions are interesting. People were shocked at the thermal efficiency of the engine elevating as high as it did with ever larger concentrations of the fuel, and the keen-eyed among them likely understood some of what was left on the table. Now, Starkman's conclusions shown here are interesting and in line with what hot rodders already knew. In effect, Starkman didn't break any new ground, but he did validate nitromethane as a fuel and as a wild source of power in reciprocating piston engines. In early 1955, USAC briefly talked of and then tabled the idea of banning nitro, again saying that they would likely ban it for 1956. In 55, it was widely used at the Indy 500 with no further talk of a ban at the race itself. That same year, in September of 1955, a newspaper story shows Lloyd Scott running a 50% load of nitro in the Bustle Bomb, which allowed him to run 150 miles per hour at the ATAA World Series of Drag Racing in Lawrenceville, Illinois. The following week, the Chemical Solvents Corporation proudly announced that its first bulk rail car shipment, 10,000 gallons worth, had left Sterlington, Louisiana, headed to Peoria, Illinois. The talk of nitromethane's endless uses, possibilities, and promises filled the story. The company had a lock on the business domestically with a patented process that made them the only truly viable volume producer. The week following this story, talking about a night race at Kingdon Dragstrip, mentions dragsters running 98% nitro in the tank and running 140-plus miles per hour. Sorry, E.S. Starkman, your 20% experiment was pretty weak sauce. In October of that year, Purdue and CSC were once again linked in the headlines as our old friend and our old pal, Luigi Crocco's concept of an extremely high-altitude engine powered by nitromethane was thrown into the public eye. Now, this was done during a symposium on nitroparaffins, and the concept for the engine was explored and touted. And, of course, closing 1955 was renewed talks of banning nitromethane at the Indy 500. It was the same song and dance as before. The AAA competition board kept saying, maybe after this year. 1956 was a relatively quiet year in the headlines for nitro. Locally, some big dragster runs popped up here and there. The Indy 500 guys finally seemed to just accept the fact that nitromethane was part of their lives, like it or not. The CSC company started advertising its variety of products in newspapers, and speed shops began advertising fuel for sale at their locations. Once again, as this ad shows us from 1956, this stuff was very, very expensive. $4.70 per gallon in 1956 money is on the order of $40+ a gallon today. There was never a cheap era of nitromethane, so never believe anybody who tries to tell you that. Outside of the newspapers, there was some magical stuff happening with fuel at the drag strip. Racers were using this stuff to much better effect, making more horsepower, and combining that with better tires and better chassis, their performances were reflecting that. Things once thought impossible for elapsed time and terminal speed were being blown away on a weekly basis. On July 29th of 1956 at Santa Ana Drag Strip, Red Hensley's rear-engine roadster with Emery Cook driving went 10-10 in the quarter mile at 155.97 miles per hour. It was mind-boggling. The car had a 331 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi with carburetors on nitromethane and ran high gear only. These numbers were a revelation. They came back the next week and went 9.98 seconds in the quarter mile with the same setup, once again blowing people's minds. Hensley planned to add a supercharger to the combination and really blow the record book away, but apparently, and this is according to Wally Park's book, health issues got in the way. Red Hensley parked the car, and drag racing's most incredible machine, at the time, was gone away. It would take a few months and one wild day at Lyons Drag Strip in early 1957 to truly turn the racing world on its head. On February 3, 1957, Emery Cook, now teamed with Cliff Bedwell, rolled off the trailer and had history in mind. Emery Cook took their slingshot dragster, still with an unblown Hemi, to a speed of 166.97 miles per hour, and this single run shook drag racing to its core. California drag strips, fearful of a sport that was outrunning the costs its participants could afford to pay and outrunning the safety their rudimentary facilities provided, made a drastic decision. Santa Ana, San Fernando, Pomona, San Gabriel, Long Beach, Kingdon, Saugus, and Colton all publicly declared that they would be gasoline only starting March 1, 1957. Wally Parks and his National Hot Rod Association agreed to support the move, but you have to remember, he didn't start it, and he didn't ask for it, but he supported it, and soon more tracks across the country with NHRA sanctions did the same. As a parting shot, before the ban kicked in on March 1st, Emery Cook took the Cook and Bedwell dragster to an 8.89 second clocking, again the quickest in the sport with their carbureted nitro-fueled dragster. Ironically, it was not the IndyCar boys who put a ban on nitromethane. It was shockingly the drag racers, the guys who had embraced the stuff from its first appearance more than a half a decade before. Now, as many of you know, most of the strips in this original group of gasoline-only rules makers reverted very quickly back to allowing nitromethane at their tracks when they saw business drop. Other sanctioning bodies like the AHRA, ITA, and ATAA never banned it at all. So while the good stuff was banned at a few tracks and was not allowed to be used at the one NHRA national event at the time, it was in use everywhere else. So much so that magazines were finally printing how-to guides on the way to properly use nitromethane. This story, written by journalist and road racing great Jerry Titus, lays out some of the history and talks about some of the interesting stuff of the day. It mentions the Starkman SAE study and gives basic tips and characteristics of nitro. It gives some potential starter mixtures, talks about what can go wrong, and basically ends with the warning that if you try this stuff, don't blame us. You're on your own. The other perhaps seminal moment in racing nitromethane history came in the summer of 1957. Records continued to tumble across the country at the drag strip, speed shot up at the Indy 500 in May, and that year a young, aspiring, and motivated drag racer from Ocala, Florida got the courage and motivation up to travel to Illinois for the World Series of Drag Racing. He wanted to test his knowledge and skills against the best after having great success in his home state of Florida. Don Garlits was awed by what he encountered. His heroes, all the big cars from the west and the central parts of the country. Now, he doubted he'd be able to compete. He then went out there and made a couple of really slow runs, basically reinforcing his doubts. His dragster was barely running in the 12s, and he was wallowing in his troubles when Emery Cook walked over and offered advice. In the words of Don Garlits in his own book, King of the Dragsters, he said he was trying to run 25% at the time and the car was just a dog. Emery Cook told him to run 95%, which absolutely horrified Garlits. He thought he would blow his engine to pieces. Cook then laid out the exact changes Garlits would need to make for the fuel system to work. He took his car to a gas station near the racetrack, modified the carburetors just as Cook told him to do, apparently stole some parts off a 55 Chevy in the parking lot to make it happen, and then promptly went back to the track. Running the 95% load of nitro, he was crestfallen once again when his car was not able to crack the 11s, and this was because of fuel pressure in the tank, which was dropping as the car went down the track, starving the engine for fuel. Now Garlits added a hand pump, which then required him to pump, steer, and shift the car down the racetrack, but he did this and managed to run near 150 miles per hour just in time to race Emery Cook in the next round. Garlits was overjoyed when he roared down the racetrack ahead of Cook and crossed the finish line until somebody let him know that he had foul started. He didn't know that until he completed the run. Now, back in the day, you were allowed multiple restarts, so after a couple minutes, he brought his car back to the starting line, and incredibly in the rerun, he beat Cook fair and square. Garlits ran 992 at 150.21 miles per hour. He'd ultimately lose the final round to Seto Pastoian. Seto Pastoian is a man I have made a video about on this channel. That video is entitled The Man Who Made Garlits and talks about Pastoian's impact not only on Don Garlits, but in early nitro drag racing. But I digress. The success and the lessons learned in Illinois stuck with Garlits and set the hook, and his career path was set. Nitromethane would be Don Garlits' life and his mastery of it an obsession for the next several decades. Now the dragsters were flying, the Indy cars were flying, nitromethane was being used in mass quantities by industry, and little did anyone know, the worst year in the then relatively short life of nitromethane was just around the corner. On a cold January morning in 1958, the unthinkable happened in Niagara Falls, New York. A railroad car with 10,000 gallons of nitromethane in it exploded without warning. The blast was massive. The tank car itself was thrown a football field. The crater it made in the ground was 150 feet across and 40 feet deep. Damage was recorded up to 5 miles away. Dozens were injured, but in an astonishing twist, no one was killed. Immediately, there were questions as to how this happened. It was a seemingly spontaneous explosion. The car was being switched at the time, and there was no indication about anything being out of place. The crater was so massive that the initial thought was that some sort of underground explosion triggered the rail car to go off. The area looked like a war zone. Trees were blown to splinters, rail cars were blown everywhere. Days and weeks went on, and investigators from every imaginable government agency poured in. The ICC, the FBI, everyone. Parts and pieces were sent to labs for testing. Damage was estimated to be in the $1.5 million range in 1958 money, and no one had any answers. Absolutely none. For months, they looked for answers and came up empty-handed. Was it possible something had not been fully expunged from the tank before it was filled with nitro, and it took a couple days for an explosive chemical reaction to take place? That was possible. Was it possible the nitromethane, which was considered a highly stable liquid, sloshed to the front of the car with such velocity that it created such a pressure wave that it ignited 10,000 gallons of it? That was also possible. In fact, there were many possibilities that were, in fact, feasible, but in the end, the answers were, we're not sure, months after starting the investigation. And then it happened again. June 6, 1958, Mount Pulaski, Illinois. This time it happened at the site of a small town. There were deaths, scores of injuries. The whole town was evacuated for fear it was going to burn to cinders or that other explosions were waiting to happen. The explosion shook homes 21 miles away. Literally every window in the town of Mount Pulaski, Illinois was blown out. There was structural damage, fires, and it looked again like a war zone. And once again, 10,000 gallons of nitromethane had mysteriously and seemingly randomly exploded. A bridge a quarter mile away from the blast site was damaged when a piece of the rail car landed on it, smashing parts of the bridge as it came down. A police officer said he was driving 40 miles per hour when the blast happened, and the pressure wave was so great it stopped his car dead in its tracks. A man said his wife was blown across their car and out the passenger window by the force of the explosion. The ICC was once again on the case, and once again it was staring at a crater 40 feet deep and 150-plus feet across. It was the same horrible nightmare happening again, and just like the first explosion, there were no answers. There were, though, more than 1,000 people left homeless by this explosion. As the early investigation began, theories about chemical contamination were leading the early thoughts of causation. The ICC in the days after the explosion recommended not handling train cars of nitromethane until the causes of these explosions were determined. Drum shipments were fine to continue, but bulk shipments would be recommended to be, apparently left where they sat or set to the side, or who knows. 2 months in, the investigators had fewer answers than they did in New York. Federal, local, state, and private investigators were on the case, and they were coming up with nothing, and ultimately would end on the same note. On September 5th of 1958, 2 news stories were published. The first announced that there was no cause of the Mount Pulaski explosion able to be determined, and that was it. No true answer would ever be given. The second story was that bulk rail shipments of nitromethane were banned completely by the Interstate Commerce Commission. It took 9 months and 2 major explosions for that ruling to come to pass, but it was handed down in September of 1958. Shipments in drums would be the way forward, and the only way forward from here on out. Government investigations into these explosions went on for a very long time, and not a single definitive cause was ever determined for either of them. So why is it safer to ship this stuff in drums? The two-part answer is, firstly, there is a virtual 0% chance you're going to contaminate a fresh drum of fuel by accidentally mixing it with other stuff. Unlike the rail cars that get filled with different things over and over, and if they're not fully cleaned out, they can react on each other, the drum is a typically one-way use container. Secondly, if in fact one of these explosions was caused by a liquid hammer type of situation where a massive rush of nitromethane toward the front of a tank car or the rear of a tank car caused a pressure wave to ignite the fuel via compression of some sort, that can't happen in a drum. The drum would fail and break open long before the pressure rose to the point of it actually being able to cause the fuel to compress and explode. This, at least, is what came from my poring over the testimonies, statements, and other records of the governmental hearings regarding these things. Yes, nitromethane was used at the Indy 500 in 1958. Yes, it was the major factor in higher and higher performance numbers at the drag strip, and yes, by August of that year, there was a shortage in racing. The explosions and ensuing stoppage of bulk shipments threw the market into a tsunami of badness. Industrial plants had to convert their processes back to barrels. Speed shops and small hot rodding operations were so far down on the priority scale they couldn't make enough noise to even get restocked, and the price continued to rise as scarcity arrived. In January of 1959, the Buffalo Courier celebrated the first anniversary of the explosions with a story detailing the issues that came with the fact that nothing had been solved, nothing would be solved, lots of insurance was unpaid, and the ripples from the mess were still on the pond. IndyCar racers wanted to get their hands on nitro, and many did, and they were paying upwards of $10 per gallon. With all the high-powered captains of industry involved in that race and their individual businesses, some of which actually used nitromethane in manufacturing processes, there was always enough to go around at the speedway for juiced-up qualifying runs and more. 1959 came to a close with unsolved explosions, hot rodders figuring out their own ways to get their hands on whatever they could for nitro, lawsuits over the explosions, and a hope that 1960 would be better. And boy, was it ever. In January of 1960, it was announced with great fanfare that Fran Hernandez, the same man from Edelbrock's shop whose car, driven by Don Towell, won the Goleta drag race, had been hired to head the Autolite Racing Division, and this had just been formed. It was one of the highest profile hirings of a pure hot rodder anybody had seen, and it was proof that nitromethane and the action of the late 40s had spawned an automotive culture that was rabid by 1960. And then, in April of 1960, Chris Karamessinis at Alton Dragway in Illinois made the fastest and most controversial run in drag racing history, clocking a speed of 204.4 miles per hour. Some believed it, and some didn't, and the debate rages on today. It shocked the drag racing and motor racing world. These were otherworldly speeds on a closed course of any type, and it seemed just too fantastical for words. It launched Chris Karamessinis into the drag racing stratosphere, made him a household name in racing, as well as a lot of money. Nitromethane was back in the headlines for explosions in 1960, but this time they were planned and put on by the government in an attempt to model what an underground nuclear explosion could do to help extract oil from oil shale. As we'll see in parts 2 and 3 of this series, the explosive nature of nitromethane and the extensive government study on it may well have been spawned by the railcar disasters of 1958. But something else was entering the lexicon of racers in 1960. A whispered about substance, something made in small batches, something that was very, very expensive, and something that may have helped Chris Karamessinis. Rocket fuel, as Humpy Wheeler calls it, yes, that Humpy Wheeler, in this 1960 story about Don Garlett's coming to Chester, South Carolina to drag race. That rocket fuel's real name was hydrazine, and it came from the German scientists of World War II. And in 1960, it was being made by one company in the country, the Olin Corporation of East Alton, Illinois. That city ring a bell? Yes, the hydrazine story will interrupt nitromethane in episode 2. The hows, the whys, the good and the bad of rocket fuel-powered dragsters will be on the docket next. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more nitro-fueled, hydrazine-popped, and high-horsepower content. See you next time.